Hello, everyone. I hope you're well. I'm Andrew Solinger, publisher of Foreign Policy, and welcome to this FP Virtual Dialogue. Today, we're excited to explore a fascinating topic around global recovery. The world continues to grapple with the impacts of the coronavirus, not only as a health threat, but also as a major disruptive force for global business, trade, and local economies, with often devastating impacts on communities and livelihoods. The pandemic has also coincided with and amplified political tensions and fissures in America's social fabric. Supporting global recovery must take all these factors into consideration to restore not just economic stability and growth, but also trust and governance domestically and American leadership abroad. Today, we'll hear from prominent leaders across policy, business, advocacy, and philanthropy on how they're supporting transformative approaches in their organizations and across sectors to ensure we use this crisis as an opportunity to advance meaningful change in how we go forward and recover. I look forward to introducing our speakers shortly. A big thank you to PMI for their support for today's program, along with our co-sponsors, the World Affairs Council of America, the Council on Competitiveness, and the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. First, a few quick housekeeping notes before we dive into the conversation to make sure you can interact with us during this session. I know you all know how to use Zoom, but to review, if you're logged in via the Zoom app, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Click the Q&A button and a window will appear where you may submit your questions. Please submit your questions as they come to mind. Don't wait until the end. We'll address as many questions as possible while we're live. When you ask a question, please be sure to provide your first name, organization, and your location, the country that you're in. This will give us a little better perspective on your question. For those calling in via phone or watching the live stream, you could submit your questions via email to events@foreignpolicy.com, again, as they arise. Here too, please provide your name, organization, and the country you're joining us from. Lastly, we encourage you to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #DrivingGlobalRecovery. Now let's get started with the program. So I have to note that yesterday, we unfortunately surpassed 1 million deaths due to COVID, 200,000 in the US alone, with many more ill amidst severe economic contraction. There is no question that transformational leadership is needed to drive this recovery. It's also worth noting that we recently passed the anniversary of Milton Friedman's seminal essay 50 years ago entitled, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Profits." This led businesses to focus on the primacy of shareholders, and the priority of profits still holds sway over large parts of the corporate world. But that's changing as leaders across industries, governments, and nonprofits rethink their roles and responsibilities. So I'd like to kick off an exploration of that discussion with our first guest, Martin King, CEO of PMI America. Martin, please unmute your mic and turn on your video. Martin joined Philip Morris International in 2003 as managing director of its Portugal subsidiary. And he's run businesses for PMI around the world, in China, throughout Asia, and in Latin America. He was CFO for the past 2 years before becoming CMO of PMI America this year. So he's got a ton of experience in international business. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you, Andrew. Glad to be here.
So I know you've done a lot of thinking yourself around Milton Friedman's philosophy, which I know has been distorted somewhat. Friedman's point, of course, wasn't that businesses should be soulless, but rather that governments should handle social issues and the welfare of their citizenry. But unfortunately, that hasn't quite worked out as well as Friedman or any of us had hoped. So something has to change. What is your view and PMI's view on the responsibility of business to stakeholders?
Well, I think it's a matter of balance. Any well-run business over the ages, going back centuries even, has always found a way to balance the desire to make profits, which is very helpful to society as well, but also the need to encourage employees, develop employees, retain employees. If you don't treat your employees well, you quickly find that your business melts away. Same thing goes for your customers. You have to look at the long term and have customers that appreciate your products and will continue to buy your products, or you don't have long-term profitability. So I think it's a matter of balancing and making sure you're taking care of all the stakeholders. And I think Milton Friedman understood that. He was just trying to be provocative and make the point that profits are an important part of having a healthy business and an important part of giving back to society as well. So I think this debate is interesting and necessary, but sometimes I think it's being made into more of a fight than is really necessary.
Great. And it'd be great to understand a little bit about what PMI is doing to refocus on stakeholders and transformative leadership at a time of crisis. And I think you're doing some interesting things specifically around PPE.
Yes, we are. We have a long time interest in eliminating, reducing illicit trade in our business. And so as we came into this time of COVID, we've applied some of that knowledge around illicit trade and some of the skill sets we have to launch a campaign in the United States to reach out and bring up the issue of illicit trade in personal protective equipment, which is a very important issue given the need for your personal protective equipment to really work and be of the highest quality. And people need to be aware that there's quite a bit of shenanigans going on around some illicit players trying to take advantage of the situation.
That's great. And I'm just kind of curious from a PMI's perspective, what sparked you to take action? What were those initial deliberations like? Was it simply, we've got to do something, or was it more existential? Be really interesting to hear your internal discussions.
Well, I think most good companies have been looking for ways to be positive in this situation. And first of all, we took care of employees and making sure we've done what we can in our local communities to help mitigate the negative effects of this terrible situation. But we quickly turned to looking for, bigger impacts and broader ways that we could be helpful. And with this skill set we have around illicit trade and with the ties we have to other organizations, we were able to mobilize a fairly large group of companies and also organizations towards addressing this issue. So we put together a campaign and launched it and funded it and got together with a number of others to really help broaden its reach. So, involve companies like Merck and Company, Procter & Gamble, Tommy Hilfiger, Under Armour, and then also groups like the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce supported it. And the whole point was to raise the issue, but also to drive solution towards and traffic towards the Department of Homeland Security so that they could also be aware of instances and follow up on it. So it was a big campaign and very, very successful.
That's great. And it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about that government cooperation, because leveraging partnerships across the industry is critical to leverage the impact and amplify the impact of all of these efforts. Do you have any new insights in regard, how do you build those collaborative approaches or ways to support policymakers, maybe specifically regarding illicit trade challenges?
Well, sure. Well, one thing is it takes time, and it's been years of building relationships and supporting different entities with local governments and all the places we do business as they address illicit trade, working with Department of Homeland Security in the U.S. And so we have very good trust and results that we've been able to achieve together with others. So when you can build on that long-term base, it's much easier to launch an initiative like this because people know that you have the skill sets and that you can deliver and that you can be trusted to do a good job on this particular piece of work. And so our people had done that over the many years. We've got a great team of people, and they were able to launch a campaign. It reached 130 million digital impressions, drove 200,000 clicks to the Department of Homeland Security's website for more information and to report suspected incidences of illicit PPE. Ran a radio campaign as well, 92 radio stations. That took it very local because a lot of folks don't actually always get their information from national media. It's surprising how many people rely on local media and local groups. So we drove it down to the local level and got 2 million impressions just through the radio campaign as well. So I think it was pretty effective, and we're very happy that we were able to play a positive role in addressing a serious problem.
That's fantastic. And it's hard to look at ROI on something like this, but it's great that you're able to measure the results and see what types of impressions and click-throughs. You're speaking media parlance now, which is excellent, Martin. Love that. I'm just curious what other, maybe you could give an example or two of other efforts you've undertaken. I know this is not the only thing that PMI has done, to aid the effort and help with recovery. There are a few other initiatives you've undertaken also. Could you tell us about those?
Yeah, I think, well, at the local level, there were many, dozens and dozens of initiatives taken by individual affiliates in different countries, sometimes using our sourcing capability and our knowledge of how to source materials to fill gaps in supply chains that people were having with either PPE or, in the case of hand sanitizer, for example, different issues. We also helped with resettling or repatriating individuals from some countries that were stuck in other countries. So there was an example of some folks from Central America that were stuck in the Dominican Republic, and we helped get them home. You know, little things like that that add up. They're small, but they're important. And our employees have always had a can-do attitude and a desire to help in the local communities. And they rose to the challenge, and each group did their part to try to make a difference, including things like, you know, helping feed people and so forth, even here in the U.S. So there's been a lot of examples. It's been great to see our employees do what they have always done well, which is reach out to the local communities.
That's great. And did I hear you correctly? You made hand sanitizer?
Yes, actually, in the early days, when there was a huge shortage of hand sanitizer in places like Europe and Asia, in our factories, we have the ability to make and mix different liquids, including the alcohol that comes with the hand sanitizers. And so we were able to actually do a home blend properly, of course, and provide that in some of the local situations.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, that's nice to hear that you did a home blend. We're a little low on that hooch at FP if you want to send samples. But I think this is a great example of the support that corporate America can give for globally for organizations. So thanks for sharing that. And thank you very much for framing the conversation for us. And again, for your support and leadership on this issue from PMI.
Great.
Thanks again.
Thank you
So
for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
great, which we'll move into right now. So please do mute your mic and video, and we'll now move right into the meat of this dialogue with an impressive group of leaders. So it's my pleasure to introduce Liz Strayer, President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, Janice Bowdler, President of JP Morgan Chase & Co. Foundation, and Brent McIntosh, the Undersecretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Please, all three of you, do turn on your video and unmute your mics, please. Great. So Liz, we'll start with you. The U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, for those who aren't aware, is a broad-based coalition of over 500 businesses and NGOs, and you advocate for strong U.S. global leadership through development and diplomacy. Maybe you could share an example of how USGLC has helped spur transformative leadership in U.S. policy and business, and how you've pivoted since the pandemic.
Well, great. Andrew, thanks for including me. Love being on with Janice and Brent. So we have this unique perspective. We're known as the Strange Bedfellow Coalition because we bring together businesses and NGOs. And I have seen a powerful transformation of the private sector working with the public sector to tackle big global challenges. And I think the COVID question is so important because if we had been here 10 years ago, Martin and Janice know this, the business community would be looking through the corporate social responsibility lens. And I'm sure Janice will talk about it's totally different now, what they've been doing in Detroit. Businesses want to do good and do well because it's part of the bottom line. And globally, it's a sea change over the last decade where businesses are partnering with NGOs, with businesses, Walmart and CARE and USAID lifting up women in Guatemala, P&G working with World Vision and USAID to provide clean water, and you can go on and on. But the COVID transformation is what's been so interesting, where we're seeing leadership like what Martin is talking about in using the platforms that they've been investing in the last decade. So, Martin talked about, making hand sanitizer, and that's the kind of thing that a lot of people need to know about. But what we're seeing in stuff that people don't know about, and I'll give you one quick example, Andrew, is PEPFAR. So PEPFAR people know about. It's the signature public-private partnership that has fought HIV/AIDS with 18 million lives saved. And what we're seeing is how this platform is being repurposed for COVID. So we saw it used in Ebola when it hit West Africa, where the health system investment was used to stop a nightmare that would have been if Nigeria had been hit, the most population country in Africa. What we're seeing now is a few examples of corporations using and transforming leadership and driving global recovery. Abbott is repurposing testing platforms for HIV, AIDS in Africa for COVID. In South Africa, hotspot for COVID, we're seeing PEPFAR training programs being used for mobilizing 28,000 contract tracers. Frankly, some are estimating 3 times more than we're using in the US. So my last point is this. The challenge going forward that we can talk about is how we can innovate and leverage these existing partnerships and platforms to respond to COVID, when frankly, we are seeing COVID impacting some of the progress that we have made over 25 years in global health. And so it's opportunity, but also real challenges.
That's great, Liz. Thank you very much for those thoughts. And it is really interesting to hear how PEPFAR in particular has been able to pivot so quickly. And some organizations were well situated, even though they were not prepared for directly for an event like this. They were well suited to pivot and prepare. And it's great to see how that's been leveraged. Treasury Undersecretary McIntosh. One thing that I know in your background, you're liaising regularly with government officials around the world, and probably before this pandemic were jet setting around at G7 and G20 meetings. And I understand you're doing a lot less of that these days and more of that on Zoom at ungodly hours. So our hats off to you for making sure you're keeping those communications flowing. I'd be really interested to hear from you how international coordination has shifted in the times of the COVID crisis, and what are some examples of that cooperation?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks for having me on today. There really has been a very substantial shift in the way we've collaborated internationally. Normally, the various multilateral bodies that were in the United States are members of, the G7, the G20, the Financial Stability Board, would be meeting pretty regularly in various places around the world. And that builds a lot of interpersonal capital among the participants. Then you move to a COVID situation where it's very difficult to travel, and those interactions move online. But the truth is they become all the more intense because of the pandemic and the twin crises we face, with both the health crisis and the economic response, where a huge portion of the global economy was taken offline through no fault of the participants in the economy. And so when we look at the bodies that have been addressing the pandemic, you look at things like the G7, where the US holds the presidency this year, and the work the G7 has been doing on things that were already priorities, and those priorities have only been amplified because of the pandemic. So I take as an example the issue of debt transparency and sustainability in the poorest and most fragile economies. That's something the G7 had been working on already to come to a unified position on and work towards solving some of the issues with the lack of transparency and a lack of sustainability in the debts in the poorest countries. And that only became all the more important as we moved into a time when the fiscal positions of those economies are in really a tough spot. And so the G7 worked together on a unified position along with the IMF and the World Bank to push for debt service suspension, where those countries can suspend their debt service payments voluntarily and instead use the freed up fiscal resources to address pandemic issues. And that was eventually adopted in April by the G20 and has been implemented through the G20 and the Paris Club and the World Bank and IMF and monitoring implementation. So those changes have been a critical aspect of the work of these institutions. Similarly, you look at the Financial Stability Board, which was a post-global financial crisis innovation. And the board was already busy working on concern for debt levels in non-financial corporates. And you look at the work that's been done since the pandemic, under the leadership of Fed Vice Chair Randy Quarles at the FSB. The work has been really collaborative. It's been heartening how our international counterparts have worked together and leveraged the relationships we've made over the years. And the collaborative work has really been, I think, you see in the data, which has really been more encouraging over the past months. You see in the data promising signs of a recovery that I think is really amplified by the international interactions we have with those bodies.
That's fantastic and very encouraging indeed. Thank you for sharing. And I want to remind everyone that you're open to send in questions. All the hundreds of you, actually several hundreds of you watching right now. And Brent, I'm gonna rephrase this question from Bruno Barawono in Ghana to make it a little friendlier. But basically, what is the impression that you get of U.S. The acceptance and the view of U.S. leadership in this time of crisis? You're on the front lines of this, and there's been some questions about U.S. leadership and our performance in the crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about how the U.S. is perceived, how welcome that leadership is, and some of the reactions you've gotten from your peers globally?
Good question. That our leadership is sought after in a time like this. If you look at, for example, the debt service suspension initiative, there were questions as to how it would work, whether it would be adopted, whether we could get all the large official bilateral creditors on board. And both the G7 and the G20 looked to the United States for leadership in focusing on how to form the terms of that engagement and how to put it together and bring all the relevant parties to the table so that we could create a situation that was conducive to a suspension of debt service payments for the poorest countries. Similarly, at the Financial Stability Board, there's very little question that countries look to the United States for leadership because of the prominence of our economy and the prominence of our financial system. And so we continue to play that role and to assume it in response to the economic consequences of the pandemic. And I would say our collaboration with our international partners has been really, if anything, greater and more intense during the pandemic because of the need for close collaboration and also for U.S. leadership.
That's very heartening to hear. Thanks for sharing. And as you can hear, we're not afraid to ask the tough questions here on our FP virtual dialogue. So please do keep them coming. Thank you, Brent. Janice, thanks again for joining us. And back to Milton Friedman. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, was a big driver of the Business Roundtable pronouncement to focus on stakeholder capitalism. And that was before the pandemic. Maybe you could share with us a little bit from a corporate perspective what JP Morgan has been doing since the crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that we get to start with that renewed statement of purpose on the corporation from the Business Roundtable. I think it really brought front and center what I think, as Liz was saying, a lot of companies have started doing, but really gives us something to organize and formalize that work. Jamie, if any watchers of Jamie have heard him say, there's no way that the bank can outgrow the communities that we serve, the places where we live and work. And so Liz already teed up our work in Detroit as a fantastic example of that. But we're doing that in cities and countries around the world. And that's created this virtuous feedback loop within our own corporation as we learn from our philanthropy and we scale through our business and we bring our business insights back into our philanthropy. That was especially important in COVID. One of our mantras going into Detroit and then the subsequent signature cities that we launched, Bay Area, Chicago, Paris, the greater Paris region, I should say, Washington, D.C. Our mantra was no New York solutions to Detroit's problems, or insert the next city that we were working in. So COVID, like a lot of other crises, you had to go local and understand what was happening on the ground. And our play was really to firm up nonprofits that were on the front lines of delivering vital services. We're not necessarily in the healthcare space. That was not our play, but we know that this was a two-sided coin, a health crisis on one hand and an economic crisis on the other hand. And economics is really where we are, shoring up household balance sheets, making sure that families and small businesses were in a position to weather a financial crisis. Those were all of our first moves. Now we're starting to look at, as we see the economic challenges facing families and small businesses are really prolonged, what's the long-term resiliency? Like, how do we get to a place where we really help families and businesses stabilize and then move into a recovery phase? Happy to talk about that more, but that's kind of been our thinking around it.
That's great and really helpful. And let's this might not be just a question for you, but it might be for all of our participants. And this is from Jamie Sutton, National Security Affairs instructor for the Physical Science Lab at New Mexico State University. I know that this is not, the foundation is not a rainy day fund for JP Morgan. It's a fantastic philanthropic organization. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But do you think companies should have a rainy day fund based on a percentage of operating budget for contingencies to not just help their own businesses, but their stakeholders in times of crisis?
So I certainly would defer to our CFO, but Jamie constantly refers to our fortress balance sheet. I think it's in the interest of our company to make sure that we're well positioned for this emergency and the next. So that comes up in a variety of ways: investing in our technology, investing in our cybersecurity, investing in our employees. The foundation is, in fact, the sort of the last mile for the bank, making sure that we are reaching communities, reaching neighborhoods that maybe the business has a hard time serving through their regular daily products. Again, our goal with that is to bring people into a path of bankability. So it creates that feedback loop. So I think that's essentially what we said we've been doing. I think you see other corporations doing something similar in this time.
I think so too. Liz, what's your view on that? Similarly, I would imagine. What are you seeing your other companies and constituents taking as their position on future challenges?
The businesses are focused on this in a way that we've never seen before. And I think what Janice is doing is leading the way. What Brent is doing in terms of the debt services is leading the way. But what I'm worried about is the cost of inaction. And are we leading enough in terms of the US government working and leading? Because only the US government can kind of lead enough. And Andrew, if I might, is talk a little bit about some of the research we've done around maybe the US, the cost of inaction, if that.
Of course, please do.
So one of the things is that we've been looking at, how do you deal with a global pandemic without a global response? And to date, and Brett and I have talked a lot about this, is to date with all the emergency relief package, which is so critical to our recovery, is our international piece of this has been 0.1% of the entire emergency relief package, which is about the same amount that we responded to Ebola, going back to that, when the outbreak was in 3 countries. And obviously this is in the entire world. So we've been looking at what is the cost of inaction? What are the consequences of not investing in an international response? Because we could get everything right here in the US, which we're obviously not. And as long as the global pandemic is anywhere, Americans are still at risk because of the health, safety, and economic recovery. So we've been looking at this $20 billion package, which was what we think is needed to make sure we get it right in terms of Gavi, our global response on vaccines, on health, and so forth. So let me give you a couple markers to take a look at. On national security, there's violent attacks in just sub-Saharan Africa are up 40% since the global shutdown compared to last year. That's just one marker on national security. Economic recovery, another marker. Before COVID, 39 million jobs in America are supported by trade. US exports and some of our biggest trading partners are way down in the developing world, particularly in COVID hotspots. 30 to 60% in countries in Asia, Latin America, Africa, compared with the same period last year. So I'll give you a couple examples. South Africa and Brazil are down more than 30%. Mexico down 38%. India down 48%. If those markets keep going down, that is going to affect our recovery. And the last thing I would say is, who's out there? China's out there. We know this. They're shipping millions of masks, flown aid donations around the world to 150 countries. I saw a tweet this summer from the Mexico foreign minister, and the tweet was, "Thank you, China, for its unwavering support during this pandemic," with 3 exclamation points. So the thing I would say is the US government has been providing ventilators. It's great. The debt service that Brent talked about is great. But while WHO needs to be reformed, pulling out has consequences. When there's vaccine conferences that we're not there, it has consequences. So your theme today, Andrew, driving global recovery, I'll go back to the point that I think we're all making. America has to be at the table. That means businesses, NGOs, and the US government is that winning formula that is part of this driving recovery.
Great, thank you for that, Liz, and thanks for that those interesting facts and research and introducing not very helpful, I want to say helpful, but tweets that reflect U.S. leadership. So we want to change that. Brent, would love to come back to you on that private sector involvement point and on global trade. What can and should the U.S. do and private sector companies do to help impact and improve upon that situation? And specifically on global trade as well, it would be helpful to hear your thoughts on what we can do to grease those wheels as well.
Let me go back to the initial question that sparked this conversation regarding government support to private corporations. It's clear that corporations should be provisioning for a rainy day. On the other hand, this is a situation where for example, I've been very much involved in the support provided to the airline industry. This is a situation where we essentially turned off the airline industry through government fiat for a period of time. And that's not something that anyone could have anticipated that we would do. And so it was deemed the appropriate thing to do to support the airline industry given that situation. More broadly, with regard to the work of corporations as part of this, as part of the response here, I think the things that both Janice and Liz have identified have been really heartening aspects of watching the dynamism of American corporations in pivoting to responsive measures. You're seeing all sorts of situations where, as we discussed earlier in the conversation, where factories are being repurposed to create PPE or other necessary materials. You're seeing an amazing amount of work done on vaccines, having been really prioritized and pushed to move as quickly as possible, given the importance. You're seeing a lot of collaboration in terms of the distribution of those vaccines. There's a lot of conversation both at the G7 and the G20 about those issues. And then with regard to trade, you're seeing supply chain coordination where we're talking bilaterally and otherwise to our partners to ensure that there is synchronization in the resumption of economic activity so that supply chains can continue to function. That's something we've discussed with a number of our larger trade partners to ensure that those linkages can continue. And then the one thing I would say is a concrete example of this. Early on in the pandemic, it was clear that business continuity plans were going to be deeply challenged here. And that this in particular applied to a number of financial institutions where they had a number of functions being done in other parts of the world. And it was vital that we ensured that the workers who were providing those functions to global financial institutions were treated as essential workers, because otherwise the financial system could have had very substantial consequences from that lack of essential treatment. And so we worked very hard at the Financial Stability Board and bilaterally to ensure that that various countries where there were a number of those functions performed understood the importance of continuing that functioning for the purposes of continued provision of financial services, as well as the cybersecurity and other aspects of the financial system. And that kind of collaboration it requires American leadership, but it also requires intense international collaboration to get it done.
That's fantastic. Another interesting question that we received was from Anushka Saraswat at the Jindal Global University in India. And it was about the dangers of vaccine nationalism. And you referenced some of the discussions around vaccine cooperation at the international level, which sounds like it's been going quite well. What can we do and what are we doing to limit and combat, what I would say, I want to say a natural tendency, but an obvious tendency to focus on one's own citizenry first in the vaccine effort cooperatively?
Well, I ultimately defer to my colleagues in our health ministry on those questions. But the first thing we can do is have a lot of good vaccine candidates in trials. And it's very clear that the vaccine development is as promising as we could have hoped. And that a number of different companies and institutions are moving rapidly toward vaccine approval, which is, I think, all to the good. And then there have been intense conversations among various developed countries on ensuring that there is vaccine available in the developing world. And those conversations are ongoing at the highest levels.
Many thanks. Janice, it would be great to talk a bit about some of the efforts that the foundation is undertaking. And we do have one question from Dylan Moore, a congressional staffer, about the role of financial institutions in a global sustainable recovery, really talking to climate in particular. And I'm wondering if that's something you can touch on for us, some of the things that the foundation might be looking at. I know you're looking at a lot of local economic development concepts, not just in the US, but around the world.
Sure, of course. And climate being an incredibly important topic and important to the firm, thinking about ways that we can lower our carbon footprint and how we can show up globally in that way. I think just as important, I am so impressed with what I've seen happen in countries across Europe where they've really brought together an economic inclusion conversation with how we're managing for climate change. And that's something that I think we need to do more of here in the US. And we've actually started piloting some work in around South Florida, around the Gulf Coast, in California, where we're seeing the effects of climate change, and they have a devastating, disproportionate effect on low-income communities, on Black and Brown communities, and of course, another two-sided coin, an environmental crisis on one hand, an economic crisis on the other. How can we move from a reactionary place to focus more on resiliency and sustainability? And so that was work that we've been involved in many places around the country here and across the globe, and look forward to doing more on. Andrew, I think you were asking me a second question in there that maybe I missed.
Was a little bit about some of the projects that you were, specifics on what you're undertaking globally. We were talking about inclusion, but also climate.
Sure. I want to zoom out for just a second here. The firm invests in the basic tenets of economic inclusion, increasingly with an equity focus on Black and Brown communities here in the US, focus on women globally. We're looking at financial health, small business, community development, jobs and skills. I think these are bread and butter issues if you're talking about how to advance an inclusive economy. But how we do that is also incredibly important. And during a time of crisis in COVID, we took a number of steps to make it actually easier to get resources into the hands of those on the front lines. It's a little technical if you're not involved in philanthropy every day, but just some things like increasing our payment frequency, moving on parallel tracks to verify payment information with nonprofits, reducing the size of our application and fast tracking approvals allowed us actually to get resources to the front lines, to those that were working with the most vulnerable really quickly. Some of the specific things that we did was dedicating dollars to small business. I think that was one of the places that we saw hit the hardest. And as we start to look towards recovery, we see more and more individuals having to turn to entrepreneurism when the job market just isn't there. So when I think about the economies that we work with around the globe, we're seeing more micro entrepreneurship. We want that to be sustainable if that's where families or individuals are opting and seeing their income come from. So when I think about places like the Greater Paris region, South Africa, all the way to what we see here in the US, certainly India, Southeast Asia, we're seeing a rise of that kind of entrepreneurism. So how can we support that by lining up the kind of technical assistance they need, as well as the access to markets that even very small entrepreneurs need in order to thrive?
That's fantastic. And you're right, that is an incredibly important area to focus on, the small business. And I think that's wonderful that that JP Morgan Chase Foundation is focusing on that. Can we talk a little bit about social inequity, racial inequity? Has also been a huge issue in this crisis: health, economics, geopolitics, and obviously this big focus on social issues that has just underlying concerns that have suddenly come to the fore. Certainly not suddenly, have been boiling for a while, but have really reached a crescendo in politics as well. How do you feel about that awareness and the trend line that we're heading in right now? And are we grasping the nettle of how to change that? It's not an easy puzzle to solve. And I know there are a few things that the foundation are undertaking in that way as well, to focus on that issue.
Look, this is our moment. There's no question we're undergoing a racial reckoning here in the US, but I'd say even in the broader global social consciousness, this is a moment where our economies are on the ropes and we're going to take measures, hopefully assertive, major measures to address our global economy, address our US economy. So now is the chance to fix our systems so that they work for all Americans. We go to where we started, the restatement of purpose of a corporation by BRT. This is what Jamie said. Like, we have to build an economy that works for all Americans. And it's very clear, we don't have to go through all of the numbers, that it has not been working as well for Black and Brown communities and other communities of color in the US. So, and I've been with the foundation for 7 years, and that entire time, we've had a track record of investing in diverse-owned small businesses, in diverse communities that have suffered from chronic disinvestment, with an eye towards how can we move more Black and Brown people into the middle class? How can we build sustainable businesses? How can we build communities? I'll just quickly give you one example of one of our marquee programs, and that's been the Entrepreneurs of Color Fund, which is now in 5 US cities, and a version of this has been replicated in other countries, essentially focusing on businesses that are they're a solid risk. They can repay a loan, but they don't fit the traditional criteria, even with increased flexibility from a regulated institution. So the answer is to build the on-ramp that they need. And we've done that with CDFI partners around the country, community development, financial institutions. And we've done that with other bank partners. If I zoom in and look at Chicago, where we've built an Entrepreneurs of Color Fund, we have 8 other corporate and private foundations at the table with us, put out more than $11 million of financing to 250 small businesses. Those businesses went into the crisis better prepared and now are in a stronger place weathering through the crisis. We can't just, there's no time like the present to get started, but I think longevity in this space is how you build trust, how you build resiliency, and how you build outcomes, measurable outcomes over time. And I'll just wrap this, sorry, I get really excited about this stuff, is that it's got to connect back to the business. Like I'm the head of the foundation. I will talk about my lovely philanthropy all day long, but building the path to bankability for these businesses, that's where we really hit scale. So I want to make sure it's clear that that's the objective here, whether we're talking about disinvested communities or we're talking about small businesses.
That's fantastic and great to hear your passion. Thank you for sharing some of those concrete examples. And it's interesting to hear about how you're really levering relationships and realizing that the scale of leveraging partnerships is what's going to bring success here. You can't do it all on your own. So thank you for sharing that. And that actually would bring me back to Liz. I can't let us finish talking through this discussion without at least referencing what we're all going to be watching on TV tonight. At least I'm pretty confident. I know I'll be watching. Liz, on politicization and bipartisanship in an election year. You know, just when we thought we couldn't get more political, here we go. And you are often referred to as a purple warrior. So in this election year, what gives you hope when it comes to collaboration cross-sector and bipartisanship, if you have any?
I do, but shockingly, you know, I'm listening to Janice, and I think exactly what she's talking about is in a version of it is happening on Capitol Hill. And I am a purple warrior, one of the few who believes that, you know, our politics can stop at the water edge. And when I watch what's happening in this space of what we're talking about, there is, you know, from Freedom Caucus to Progressive Caucus, this is one of the last, you know, places of hope where there is actual agreement. And I'll give you a couple examples where, you know, the idea that America needs to be engaged in the world, that when it comes to a global pandemic, there has to be a global response, that diplomats, global health, American aid investments is connected to our health and safety, and our economic recovery is real. And the examples are that when you look over the last, you know, last decade, this is the space where there has been the most bipartisan legislation, bar none. Women and girls, development finance, food security, all the things that Janice has been talking about and that Brett has been talking about. But on COVID, here too is where we've seen it. This summer, there was these massive bipartisan letters in the House and the Senate, Senator Rubio, Senator Cardin, about that we need to have a global response with real money in these packages, led with people like, you know, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Risch signing on, people who are in very tough races, like Senator Gardner and Collins and Tillerson. We saw military leaders weigh in on this. We saw evangelical and faith leaders weigh in on this. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce weigh in. Normally, I am all over the country, Andrew, during this season, holding town hall meetings with members of Congress. I'm doing them virtually now. And members of Congress, as I said, from Freedom Caucus to Progressive Caucus, to talk with their constituents about why leading globally matters locally. Again, just what Janice was talking about. And I thought it would kind of slow down because of COVID. It has accelerated, and members of Congress want to talk to their constituents, where we're having overwhelming response about from the constituents that are joining on these Zoom calls that want to talk because they get that these countries that, you know, you think some of them can't find them on the map, but they really understand that part of our recovery is understanding weak and fragile health systems in other parts of the world impact us. And I'll just close because I also am a student of polls, and I see it. We did a morning consult poll a few months ago, and 8 of 10 voters support increased funding, not just increased support, but actually increased funding for State Department and USAID for these small, you know, these countries on the other part of the world to help keep our keep us safe. And it reminds me of something that Ronald Reagan's chief of staff just recently said. We all know Tip O'Neill's comment that all politics is local, and he said today all politics is international, because we are connected. And it goes back to your theme of this program, that if we are going to drive global recovery, it is a part of how we connect to the world, and all the different stakeholders matter.
Thank you, Liz. Very, very purple.
Very purple.
and very helpful. And Brent, I'd be curious, not at all to get political, but sort of the same question to you. There's been so much made of renewed great power competition up until now. We've referenced it a few times, so not specifically with China, but how are you feeling? I think you've referenced it a few times in this conversation, the cooperation that you're seeing, the work that we're seeing across countries. And we talked about it also when we asked you about vaccine nationalism. How are you feeling about the sense of cooperation and the spirit of working together across different nations and regions at a time when there's nationalism left, right, and center?
We're really seeing a lot of collaboration internationally on these topics. And so I'll take the debt service suspension initiative as an example. That's one where there are clearly issues to be worked through regarding different countries' participation in it and full and faithful implementation. But there's no question that countries are committed to doing this on behalf of the poorest countries. And we need to work through some of the complexities of who participates how. That said, when we took this to the G20 in April, countries were eager to help out these poor countries. And so as we work toward extending the debt service suspension initiative, inevitably, as there are in any international negotiation, there are questions about who's faithfully participating and to what extent and how the contours and terms of that work. But there's no question that we support the idea of providing suspension of debt service payments for the poorest countries. And similarly, if you look at, for example, the collaboration, we've looked for innovative ways to collaborate as well. So for example, the Five Eyes countries, the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand have traditionally been a security alliance. We've started having finance ministerial conversations to share best practices because of the shared cultural heritage we have. And those have been incredibly productive conversations that we've had among the finance ministers of the Five Eyes countries. Similarly, we're looking at this is a time when, because of the nature of the pandemic here, the digital payment system is all the more important. And so the international collaboration in focusing on improvements in the digital payment system, including new technologies like stablecoins and how they're going to play as part of the international financial system, has been something that where our cooperation with international counterparts has intensified during the pandemic. You would think that something like that might fall off the agenda. On the contrary, it's become all the more pressing, and we've had very good, substantial conversations in any number of forums, whether it's the G7 and G20 or the Financial Stability Board on those topics. And so I don't see a breakdown in collaboration. On the contrary, the importance of the historical moment we face has led to greater collaboration internationally, and that's been heartening.
That is really heartening. And Janice, let's come back to you, hopefully with some heartening comments on that front as well. You just led off that discussion about the moment is now to seize, to change some of it and act on some of the issues that we have socially, globally. What, if you can find a silver lining, anything that encourages you about what's been taking place? Is it that finally, folks who are reluctant or haven't prioritized this type of issue are now stepping into action? Is there anything positive that you're seeing coming of what's from what's been happening?
Yeah, well, I think you named a big one. There's no room for us to sit on the sidelines. And I think for me, what is really inspiring is seeing the way in which our company is able to pull against all levers. As one of the largest banks in the world, we have a number of levers to promote financial security, economic stability, from Fortune 500 companies down to the single mom who's trying to make it work while she does Zoom school with her kids. I'm going through Zoom kindergarten, so I can tell you that's a real thing. It's hard on a lot of families and particularly hard on women right now. We have a lot of levers that we can pull there, but we're also looking at how can we be good advocates on policy. We stood up a policy center. Yes, we have a traditional government relations team, but we, for example, at the beginning of the year, looked at how we could reduce barriers for people with criminal records, to be able to have some of those records expunged, to be able to move more into full employment, including those with non-financial crimes, to come back and work in the banking system. So both putting the money where our mouth is and advocating for things that we know are going to create greater economic opportunity. Let me close by mentioning something that maybe is a little unconventional. And that is that in addition to the economic inclusion work, which is definitely in our comfort zone, thinking about all the financial levers that we play, we've also just started a pilot, just a couple series of grants around racial healing, recognizing that at the heart of of what we are experiencing on a racial reckoning, that we have to put healing and reconciliation at the front of that. That's not always how you hear corporations talk, right? We like to talk about economic opportunity, but we're pushing into this space because we are hearing from communities that this is what they need, and it's what they need in order to be effective. I'm really excited to see what comes of that. I don't want to overstate it. We're just trying it out. But I think it's that kind of creativity and a willing to try new things that is going to push us into a more sustainable recovery.
That is a fantastic point to close on. We started out this conversation with mentioning horrible numbers and how big a lift and crisis we had ahead of us, but I'm encouraged by the examples of cooperation locally, across social strata, across companies and industries, and across governments that internationally, that are, it's very heartening. And I thank you all for sharing those insights, and I thank the audience for listening in on them. So that's all the time we have right now. Unfortunately, as always, I'm afraid we have to end it here. But I want to thank our panelists, of course. It's been a truly fascinating and insightful conversation. Our distinguished speakers, we appreciate you spending time with us this morning, and thank you for sharing your expertise and insights on these important issues, and thank you for your leadership. A big thanks to our audience as well. It's been a pleasure to have such an engaged and thoughtful audience tuning in for our virtual dialogues. While of course we will miss you after this show. We miss being able to see everyone in person. We certainly appreciate the ability to get you all virtually together, and for these truly global gatherings of people who are experts, leaders, and influencers on these important issues. So thank you for tuning in. And do stay tuned for upcoming virtual events. We have a whole slate of them coming up here at FP, including a virtual dialogue tomorrow on human rights and older persons, addressing the compounding effects of COVID-19 on the lives and human rights of older adults around the world. We'll be joined by UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and other prominent human rights champions. That event will take place tomorrow, September 30th at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Please do join us for that as well. And we have many more virtual dialogues planned for this fall. And you can find information about tomorrow's dialogue and all of our programs at foreignpolicy.com/events. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Take care and see you soon.